Kira and welcome to another video. Today I'm going to be talking you through all of the books which I managed to read in June, although looking out of the windows behind me, it doesn't feel quite right to say that I'm talking about June books because it looks so grey, so windy, and it feels so cold that I can't quite believe that it's June. I feel like summer came a little bit early this year because April and May were both absolutely boiling hot and sunny pretty much every single day, and now that it's actually June, or technically now July, because we're now at the beginning of July, the weather seems to have just transitioned into a very autumnal feel, which I do like because I love autumn, but it definitely doesn't feel like summer. But I digress. June books, I managed to read a total of 6.5 books in June, and I'll get onto that half book at the very end of this video. But for the most part, I really enjoyed them. I felt like when I came to the end of June that I really hadn't read much at all, and that's mostly because at the end of June I finished my yoga teacher training, and that made up the predominant focus for my month of June, and I felt like I didn't actually do that much reading. So when it came to the end of the month and I found out that I'd actually read just over 6 books, I was actually really pleased with that total, and I can't believe that we're now over halfway into the year, and I've currently read at this point, including some books in July, 44 books, which means I'm just ahead of schedule of my 75 books for the year goal, which I'm really happy with. So without further ado, I have 6.5 books to talk about, so let's get straight into it. I got off to a really great start in June because the first book that I picked up was a 5-star read, and that was The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton. This was one of the books I was gifted for my birthday at the end of May, and I read it pretty much straight away and really enjoyed it. And like I said, I gave this one 5 stars, and I feel like it was such a surprising 5-star read for me because I really didn't expect to enjoy it, and yet it actually ended up being such an incredible book. I'm not entirely sure how to categorize this book, whether it's YA dystopian, YA like coming of age story, but essentially this is a book which focuses on 2 rival gangs, and in particular we're following one young character called Ponyboy who is part of a gang called the Greasers. Greasers are essentially a gang made up of people from the less economically well-off side of town. So in this gang we have Ponyboy, who is like the youngest member of the gang. He's only 14. His 2 older brothers, Darry and Soda Pop, are both also part of this gang, and also all of their friends. And so we're kind of more immersed in the Greaser side of this rivalry because of the fact that we're reading it from the point of view of someone in that gang. But Ponyboy is a little bit different, I'd say, to the other Greasers. He's very academic and really sort of is aware of the fact that the only thing sort of keeping him in that group is A, his connection to the fact that his brothers are both in it, and B, the fact that he's just not economically well off, and he very much recognises and is aware of the fact that if he was well off and he was as academic as he is, he definitely wouldn't be in these same situations that he finds himself in. So that's kind of the introduction, and then the rival gang, which I just mentioned, is the Socks. I've been told in a comment where I mentioned this video that it's meant to be pronounced like short for socials, so I guess that would be like socials, but clearly that does not come out very naturally. So just for the purposes of this video and not sounding like a complete idiot, I'm just going to stick to Socks. So we have the Socks, and they're essentially the direct opposite to the Greasers, only in the sense that they are from a much more economically well-off background. But aside from that, both sides of the gang are pretty similar. They dress differently, maybe have different hobbies, but they're both essentially just involved in this gang rivalry. They fight with one another, they're both horrible to each other, and there isn't really much separating them except for economic status. We also have the added layer of sort of tension in the fact that Soda Pop and Ponyboy are currently under the guardianship of their eldest brother Darry, and that's because their parents passed away, and Darry has then taken on the responsibility of trying to look after his 2 younger brothers. But because of the fact that they're not from a very economic, well-off background, he then has this added pressure of trying to make sure that they're both doing well, staying in school, and just essentially like making sure that he looks like a good guardian so that he can keep the family together. There's a lot of pressure there, and for that reason there's a lot of tension between the 3 brothers, all of which is founded on the fact that they all care about each other, but that kind of doesn't become clear until later in the book, and at the beginning it just seems like there's a lot of tension. And then we essentially get into the sort of main story of the book after being introduced to these two rival gangs. And essentially Ponyboy and one of his friends from the Greasers, Johnny, get involved in a really, really big issue. And because of this, everything changes for all of the gangs and a lot of tension, drama, violence, and all of that kind of stuff arises. And it really forces Ponyboy to assess his view on what he's involved in and what he wants to do with the rest of his life, and whether or not he wants his economic and social background to be the factor that determines everything that he does going forward, because he kind of sees this situation that he's been involved in as a bit of a crossroads where he can make a decision that really sort of affects the rest of his life. And all of this happens in a relatively short book. This book is only just over 200 pages, so it's really, really short, and yet you do feel like you get to know all of the characters so well. I feel like on the whole I've been relatively vague because of the fact that it is a relatively short book, and I don't want to sort of spoil anything because drama and action happens quite quickly in this book, and so it's really easy to get spoiled if you go too deeply into the plot. But essentially what sort of overrides this entire novel is what I've just mentioned, that social commentary about how easy it is for your economic background to determine how you are viewed by society, how you view yourself, and where you think you can end up. And we see this as being true of both Ponyboy and also his eldest brother. And his eldest brother is someone else who could have been successful had he have been born into a different background, and yet because of his background and the fact that both of his parents had passed away, he's now taken on this responsibility and feels like he's kind of trapped in this situation because he doesn't see any way out, whereas if he'd been born with more wealth, that would have been a very different situation. And so it's a really, really interesting commentary on how our economic status has such an impact on everything else that we do, and predominantly on how we view ourselves, which is obviously a really, really important issue. So I really, really liked it, and I was so impressed to find out that the author, S.E. Hinton, was only 17 years old when she wrote this book, which is just so impressive. And so I really, really loved this one. I'd highly recommend it. I honestly hadn't heard of this book until I was gifted it for my birthday, and I'm so glad that I was, because it wasn't on my radar at all. So I can't say I would have ever read this book if Jay hadn't bought it me for my birthday, and so I'm really glad that he did, and highly recommend picking it up because it was such a good read. So the next book that I picked up in June was an audiobook of a non-fiction, and it actually happened to be the very first book that I've ever listened to on audiobook, which is really great because audiobooks are something that I haven't ever really gotten into until now, mostly just because I really, really love reading physical books, and so I just haven't ever really delved into the world of audiobooks, despite everyone saying that they're so, so good. But I now feel like I've definitely changed my opinion on them and definitely want to listen to more, particularly when it comes to listening to non-fictions. I absolutely love listening to podcasts and find them to be such a great way to digest and learn more information, and I feel like it really engages me more so than when I read non-fiction information. And when I listened to this audiobook in particular, it did really just listen as though I was listening to a really informative, in-depth podcast about a really important issue. And so I definitely think going forward that because I want to read non-fiction more, I feel like audiobooks are definitely the way to go, because I just feel like that is the best way for me to engage with and really process the information. And so I'm definitely going to be listening to more audiobooks of non-fictions in the future. So you'll definitely be hearing me talk about more, but for now, the one that I listened to in June was Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Rennie Edo-Lodge. This was a really, really informative book about the history of racism, and it essentially delves into how and why racism is so systematically ingrained in society. And it's a book that I'd highly recommend for everyone to read for this reason, because it was written in a very, very digestible way. The information was clear and easy to understand, but it also explored such a depth of issues, and it sort of addressed the issue in a really, really easy to understand way by going right back into history and exploring this subject right up until the present day. So you really had an understanding of how this isn't an issue that is sort of left in the past and is something that is still present and very much alive in today's modern society. So like I said, I definitely recommend this book to absolutely anyone, but in particular I'd recommend it if, like me, you are from Britain, because Rennie Edo-Lodge is a British author, and so in particular she's written about the history of racism in a British context, which is, I think, really, really important. This is a subject which of course everyone needs to learn more about, and we all need to be focusing on how we can change, learn and do better, and I think that change and learning should most obviously start with something that is directly applicable to your life. And so reading about something that is in the context of the place where you live just makes more sense to me, because I feel like it just is easier to understand and recognize perhaps areas where you've been sort of implicit in racism and how racism has been sort of surrounding you your whole life, and potentially as a white person you might not have even noticed it because it's not always something that is in your face, if you know what I mean. So I think it's really important to find books about this topic which are maybe more applicable to you, at least if that's where you're starting. And for me, this was the first book I've read on this topic, and so reading one which was very clear, easy to understand, and focused on a context which actually surrounds me on a day-to-day basis just made absolute sense. So I definitely recommend this book if you are in particular someone in Britain who is wanting to learn more about this topic. Now, because of the nature of this topic, I'm definitely not reading this book in a critical way. I read this book purely to learn more, find out more information, and just to, like I say, learn more about this topic. And so I haven't rated this book in a critical sense because that wasn't the reason that I read it, and I don't really feel like it's my place to do so. But I did give this book 5 stars on the basis that it was so informative, so easy to understand, and I found it to be very, very impactful, and it's one that I definitely recommend if you haven't read physically or listened to this book. So June also happened to be the month where the Make Your Myth Taker readathon was taking place, and this was a readathon that's being run by Ashley and Charlotte from the Myth Take book club, and I was so excited to take part in this readathon because I love Myth Take so much. And I actually got off to a really great start by reading The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern as my first read for this readathon, and this was one which I read for the prompt to read one of the host's favourites. And I did this because it was one of Ashley's favourites, and it's also a book which I'd heard lots of good things about, and having now read it and rated it 5 stars, I can 100% confirm that this is a book which is well worth reading. I think I've only ever come across one person who doesn't really like this book, which is of course completely valid, but for the most part this is a book which seems to be universally loved and enjoyed, and I was one of those people who absolutely loved it. This is a book which I don't even know where to begin to describe because it is just so immersive and experiential when you come to reading this book that it's something that I feel like it's really difficult to convey without having read it yourself. However, this is a book which takes place over quite a number of years. It starts in the mid-1800s and goes right up through until like the the early 1900s. So it's quite a long period of time, and we essentially see the conception of the concept of the night circus, which is a really, really immersive and unique circus concept where we have the most incredible performers of every different type that you might see at a circus, and this circus essentially just turns up places. There's no sort of guaranteeing how long it will stay for or whether it will just be there for one night, but one day it's just gone and that's that. And these people who go to the circus are completely changed by the experience because it is just so wild, immersive and dreamlike. Particularly because it's a night circus, so you can only go to this circus after sundown and you can stay until like sunrise, and that is how long you're allowed to be there. Throughout the day, no one is allowed to go in except for the people who are part of the circus. And so we see this book from quite a few different points of view. We see people who are attendees at the circus, and we're also introduced to a group of reveres, who are people who essentially try and follow the circus around, and they mark themselves by wearing like black and then just one shocking bit of red which kind of marks them as these followers of the circus. But we also see the people who created the circus and the people who are performing within it. So it's a really, really interesting book. We have so many different perspectives and also get to see characters develop over such a long period of time. So the circus itself is of course a really key part of the book, and I'd argue that the circus definitely becomes a character in and of itself because it is so sort of full of character, if that makes sense. It is so like dreamlike, immersive, wild and vivid that it's kind of a character in and of its own right. So that is one key element of this book. But then we're also introduced to the idea that there is a competition ongoing between two of our main characters, Celia and Marco. Celia and Marco know that they're involved in this competition, but they don't understand the context of it, and nor do we as readers. We just know that there's this competition and they essentially have to work on bettering one another and outdoing each other with the magic that's going on at the circus, but they don't know how the competition ends or wins. And over time they also develop a very complex relationship with one another, knowing that they're both competitors, but they've also got this indescribable bond. And so there's a constant mystery ongoing throughout this book because we know there's a competition that's that's clear almost from the beginning of the book, but we don't know anything else about the context of the competition or how it works. And then the circus itself, being kind of a character in and of its own right, adds another layer of mystery. Because it is so full of character, it's really hard to understand and it's so unpredictable, and you feel like it could do absolutely anything. So this is a book which I'd highly recommend reading, because I feel like I've probably not done it justice at all in trying to describe it through my own words, but it is a book which feels so immersive and vivid. You feel like you've been transported into the night circus, and it's just such a magical reading experience. And I now definitely want to read The Starless Sea, which is Erin Morgenstern's other book, just because her book, although the night circus was a really interesting concept, I think what made her book so incredible was just the immersive and vivid writing style, which I'm sure she will have explored in her other book as well. So I loved this one, and it was a great start to Myth Take, although it was pretty much one of the only books I ended up reading for Myth Take, but we'll get onto that in just a minute. So the next two books that I picked up in June were actually both rereads, and I'm going to talk about them both together just because I have a joint reading vlog up for them up on my channel, which I'll link for you if you want to go and check it out and hear some more in-depth thoughts. But also I'm going to talk about them together because they're by the same author, and they are two books which I feel like I've talked about pretty much non-stop for the last couple of months, and so I don't want to bore you with another huge exploration of all of my thoughts, because that reading vlog that I just put up probably says it all best and in the most depth. But essentially those books were Normal People by Sally Rooney and Conversations with Friends, also by Sally Rooney. Now that we are over halfway into the year, I can confidently say these are my two favourite books of the year so far, and I'm just absolutely obsessed with them. I actually read Normal People for the first time in January, and then Conversations with Friends in March, and I loved them both so much that I decided to reread them in June. This was kind of sparked by the fact that at the end of April and beginning of May, I watched the new TV adaptation of Normal People, and because I enjoyed that so much, and so did my friend Carolyn, we decided to do a reread of Normal People as a 24-hour readathon. But then I finished Normal People with some time to spare, so I decided to also reread Conversations with Friends in order to essentially try and determine which of the two I like best. But I've realised that is an impossible question because I just love them both so much. So they are currently in joint first place, and I really can't see that changing. Now, like I said, I've talked about these books both in so much depth that I don't really want to go into a huge exploration of all of my thoughts, but essentially just to summarise the books if you're not familiar with them. Normal People is a book which follows the relationship of our two main characters, Connell and Marianne, over a 4-year period. It starts when they're 18 and just about to leave high school, and their relationship kind of kicks off in a bit of a tumultuous way. Marianne is someone who is very, very wealthy and knows Connell because his mum is her cleaner, and that's kind of how they sort of spark a relationship outside of school. But Marianne in school is not very popular and no one really talks to her. Whereas Connell is really, really popular and has loads of friends and is really well liked. But they kind of spark this connection outside of school, mostly because of the fact that they're very, very intellectually equal to one another. They're both very clever, and Connell's friends, despite really liking him, don't really match him on that same intellectual level. So in Marianne, he finds someone who he feels like he can really be himself around. And so as well as sparking a little bit for friendship, they also spark a romantic relationship. But this is one which has to be kept a secret because Connell is really scared of the repercussions it might have on his popularity in school. So the relationship obviously starts with him treating Marianne in not the best way, unintentionally, but he obviously really damages her self-esteem because he makes her feel like as though she's someone who needs to be kept a secret. But despite this, they end up going to the same college together in Dublin. They go to Trinity College together, and from there we see this relationship sort of span over a 4-year period right up until the end of their college experiences, and throughout that time we see their relationship go in so many different directions. They can go from absolutely loving each other, being in a committed relationship, being in a casual relationship, being the absolute best of friends, and also absolutely hating each other, all in a matter of pages, because it's a book which really jumps through different timelines. You might have one chapter which is like 2 weeks apart from the next one, and then another one where it's like 4 months have passed, and you do get told that by the titles because it tells you the dates and how much time has passed since the last chapter. And so we see this very, very tumultuous relationship, but the one constant is that they always really care about each other and constantly magnetize one another back into their lives. But in this book we see a relationship which is extremely complex, and it's one which I feel like is probably one of the most realistic looks into romance that I've ever seen. And I feel like the purpose of this book for Sally Rooney Rooney is to kind of challenge what romance has become in literature. Romance typically follows a very, very predictable arc, whereas this book was anything but predictable. We saw this relationship go through so many peaks and troughs, and essentially it just sort of explored the fact that relationships are not linear, and the book ends in such an open way that it forces you to confront the fact that characters cannot just be stopped at the end of a book. This book ends in a particularly open way in order to show you essentially that books cannot fully explore what goes on in relationships. There's no way you can show everything in the context of one book, and so we don't know what happens to Marianne and Connell because their relationship is sort of orchestrated to be so realistic that essentially anything could happen. It's not linear whatsoever, but it is so compelling and incredible. So that is Normal People. Conversations with Friends is another book which delves into relationships in a less conventional way. In this book we follow our main character Frances, who is at Trinity College as well, along with her best friend and ex-girlfriend Bobby, and they also perform spoken word poetry together. And at one of their performances they're approached by an author called Melissa, who decides that she wants to write a piece about them, and in doing this she kind of invites them into her circle, and from there the book kind of really kicks off. Bobby becomes very interested in pursuing Melissa, whereas Frances becomes very interested and forms a quite good connection with Melissa's husband, Nick. From there, it becomes clear that Melissa and Nick don't have the most ideal marriage, and yet they're still together. And this book is one which explores the complexities of relationships in such an interesting way, because we have this group of 4 people who are all connected with each other in very, very different ways. We obviously have a marriage between Nick and Melissa, we have a friendship and the spark of an old romance between Frances and Bobby, we have the potential for new romances between Bobby and Melissa, between Nick and Frances, and we have this very, very complex fact that they're all sort of becoming friends with one another. And so these relationships cannot be sort of confined to just 2 people, and that is really what I think Sally Rooney tries to show in this book by exploring polyamory in a way which isn't the sense of people choosing to have a polyamorous relationship as such, but more in the way that polyamory kind of sneaks up on this group of 4 people and forces them to assess the way that they view relationships. It's just really interesting because she really explores how you can't have a relationship that's confined to 2 people. Not to say that you can't have a romance that's just including 2 people, but that all of your other relationships impact every single other relationship you have. The way that you interact with your mum, for example, will depend on how you feel about your dad, potentially any siblings that you've got, and all of you have a relationship together, which sort of relies on and is impacted by the connections that each of you have with the other people. And so this book really explores how friendships, relationships, romances all interconnect and impact how you view other romances and friendships that you get involved in. And so it's just a really, really interesting book. Frances and Marianne, in my opinion, are very, very similar protagonists. They're both very intellectual, can be seen as people who view themselves as quite superior to other people, but are also people who confront very, very difficult issues in terms of their self-image and self-esteem. And these books also delve into the issues of mental health quite a lot in a really, really impactful and raw way. And just in general, Sally Rooney is a genius, to say the least. I absolutely love her books, and I'm kind of sad that there's only 2 of them because I just want to read everything that she ever puts out, although I'm also glad that she's an author that is of course so young and has the capacity to write so many other books going forward. So even though I have to wait for them, I am so excited for anything else that she puts out because these were so good. So good. The next book that I picked up for June was actually the only other book that I read for the Myth-Take Readathon, which was not intentional whatsoever. It just so happened to be how this month kind of panned out, and that book was The Wicker Light by Mary Watson. I read this one to meet a prompt for reading a sequel to a book that you'd already read, and I thought it was nice to reread this one because this is a very folklore-y, mythical type book, and it was also a sequel of a book which I read for Myth-Take Reads last May or June, and so it felt really nice to revisit it around a year afterwards and read the sequel. Although to call it a sequel, I'm not sure if that's entirely accurate. It's definitely a companion novel, but we do view different characters and have different perspectives, so I'm not sure it's entirely a sequel, but I felt like it was connected enough to work for this prompt. And I really enjoyed it. Mary Watson has such an incredible atmospheric and dark writing style, which I absolutely love, and so I really enjoyed this one and gave it 4 stars. So just to give a little bit of context about what happens in the Wren Hunt, because although you don't fully need to have read the Wren Hunt to understand this book, I do feel like it definitely helps with giving you more context about what is going on, because it does explore quite a complex area of Irish folklore, which I still don't feel I fully understand. And essentially in this book, we are taken to a small town in Ireland called Kilshamble, and there we are exposed to this area of Irish folklore, which is essentially an ongoing rivalry between two groups called the Judges and the Augurs. In a lot of ways, these two groups are very, very similar to one another. They both engage in rituals and magics and are very, very connected to nature, but they also have this ongoing, very, very intense rivalry, which predominantly surrounds the fact that they have to use very similar methods to gain their power, and so the other group is consistently a threat to them because these sources of power have dwindled over the years, and so over time they've sort of been opposed to one another because they use slightly different methods but need similar power sources, and so they're constantly seen as threats to one another. But this has kind of developed into an ongoing, quite violent rivalry between these two groups. In the Wren Hunt, we're predominantly exposed to the Augurs because Wren is from an Augur family, and we see her in this rivalry between the Judges, whereas in this book we're actually getting two perspectives, which I found really interesting because I do love multiple perspective narratives. I think they give a lot more context and are just really, really interesting. And in this one we have David, who is a character who's in the Wren Hunt, but he's a judge, so it's really nice to have that opposing view to what we did get in the Wren Hunt. And then we also have Zara, who is a complete outsider to this town. Her family moved there relatively recently, and her sister Layla became very interested in this folklore, got caught up in some issues, and then she passed away very, very suddenly, which caused a lot of mystery because of the fact that although she was very clearly dead, there was no clear medical reason for her death. And so because of this, Zara becomes very, very interested in following Layla's steps in order to try and figure out what potentially caused her death and what she was involved in. Zara and David then become kind of connected with one another, and their stories constantly intertwine, and we see them finding out more about each other, which is very interesting. And I just think this book was a great sort of antithesis to the Wren Hunt because it really forced you to question all of the assumptions and beliefs that you'd built up through your read of the Wren Hunt. Because in the Wren Hunt you're reading the book from the perspective of an Augur, you kind of develop the idea in your mind that the Augurs are the good guys and the Judges are the bad ones. And typically the Judges are seen as the more violent group. However, in this book, although you don't necessarily like the Judges, you also come to realise that they are not necessarily the bad guys, and that the Augurs engage in just as many negative, violent and sort of underhand behaviours in order to get what they want. And so in this book you really do have to challenge the beliefs that you've sort of created about the Augurs, and those are kind of put on their head, and you really sort of see the darkness that has come from this rivalry, and that it can't just be sort of, that the blame can't just be pointed at one side of this rivalry, and you see how connected both sides are with it and how willing both are to act out such a violent and potentially quite evil activities in order to gain what they want, regardless of the consequences for anyone else. And of course, following Zara is really interesting because she, like you as a reader, doesn't really know all that much about what's going on, and so it's a really, really unique and useful opportunity to find out from like a first-hand point of view about what exactly is going on. And I think that made it really interesting because we have someone who's very much connected to the Judges and someone who doesn't really know anything about either and is trying to figure out what exactly is going on. So overall, this was a really great book. I actually preferred this one to the Wren Hunt because I feel like this book deals with some very dark topics, more so than in the Wren Hunt. And like I said, Mary Watson writes in such an atmospheric and dark way, which just makes the books really compelling. So I'm really glad that I've read this one, and it was a really interesting read. So those are the 6 full books that I read in June, but like I said, I did read 6.5 books in June. And the reason I said I read 6.5 was because the final book that I read in June, I don't think counts as a full book because it was a short story, but I only read one short story from a collection of 4, so I'm just counting that as a half book. And that book was Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank Redemption, which was part of this Stephen King collection called Different Seasons. I definitely want to read all of the books in this short story collection at some point, but the reason that I only read one on this occasion was because I was actually doing a 24-hour readathon where I was reading books that were on the Rory Gilmore reading list, and Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank Redemption was on that list, but none of the other short stories were. So for these purposes, I just read that first book in the short story, which was 132 pages long, so I'm counting that one as a half book just because I didn't read this entire book, I just read one section of it. But essentially, we can call this 6.5 books, I think. So like I said, I read Rita Hayworth and The Shawshank Redemption and I really enjoyed it. Shawshank is a film which I really have enjoyed for a long time. I think it's such a good film, and I was really interested to find out that it was actually based on a short story, mostly just because it's quite a long film and has a lot of depth and character development, and so I was really interested to see how they got so much character development and depth from a short story. Not that short stories can't have a lot of depth, but usually I wouldn't expect a short story to be turned into such a long and in-depth film. I feel like Shawshank is a film that most people have watched, and so I don't know how much explanation I really need to give here, but essentially Shawshank is a prison, Shawshank Penitentiary, and there we are met by our main character, or our protagonist rather, Red, who is telling us the story of another prisoner. And if you've seen the film, you'll know that Red is played by Morgan Freeman, and so the voice in my head whilst I was reading this book was definitely reading out all of the lines in a Morgan Freeman voice, which I think made the book even more fun. So that was definitely the case, and if you've read this book, definitely let me know if you did that as well, or if that's just me, but I just couldn't help it. It just seemed to come directly from Morgan Freeman himself, which I really liked. And so we are getting the perspective of Red, and he's telling us about another prisoner called Andy Dufresne. Red is in the prison for a few years before Andy turns up, and Red is there for murder, and he's fully accepting of the fact that he did a crime, and he accepts that. However, one of the things that Red always says is that he's one of the only people in prison who's there for actually doing a crime, because he notices that most other prisoners are unwilling to say what they've actually done, or say that they've just been put there by mistake. And so one day, a few years after Red's sentence begins, Andy Dufresne turns up in prison, and he's also there for the murder of his wife and her lover, but Andy is adamant that he didn't actually commit the crime. And so at first, Red views him as just someone like everyone else in prison who doesn't actually want to say what they've done, but then eventually he kind of becomes a little bit closer to Andy and starts to potentially believe in his innocence. This book is a short story, like I said, but it's written over a really long period of time, like a long time. I don't know exactly how many years, but it starts at the very end of World War II, so the late 40s, and goes right through at least until the late 70s, if not slightly later. So we're following these characters over a long period of time, and of course throughout that entire period they're stuck in prison together. But Red and Andy form this relationship, and Red starts to sort of tell Andy's story and explain sort of how Andy's a little bit different from all the other prisoners. Now, if you've seen Shawshank, you'll know exactly what happens. If you haven't, I don't want to give it away, but this is a book which is filled with a lot of drama, tension, plot twists and surprises, and it is really interesting to see how much Stephen King managed to fit into such a relatively short book, because it was, like I said, only 132 pages, so not very long at all, but there's so much in there. The one difference I've noticed between the book version and the film version is that in the book we really do focus just on Red telling Andy's story, and there are a few mentions of other prisoners which obviously are relevant to Andy's story, but we don't really get any major explanation of them or any development of them as characters, whereas in the film all of those little snippets of other characters are really fleshed out, and you get to know people a lot more, and that is of course how they ended up turning it into a full-length feature film. Neither one is better than the other. I probably would have liked to have seen some of the characters maybe developed a little bit more in the book version, but overall Andy's story is the thing that is most compelling and the most interesting, and is what is pulling you through this novel or pulling you through the film. And so hearing his story from the perspective of Red is really interesting. Whether or not you are hearing about other characters or not, Andy's story is just very compelling. And I also think Stephen King really played on the fact that we're getting this information through a lot of filters. We're focused and invested in Andy as a character because we want to know what happens to him and what happened to him throughout his entire experience in prison. However, we know that we're getting this through so many different levels. Red is telling us the story, and although we're getting it from his perspective and therefore want to trust him as a narrator, he also makes it very clear that a lot of time in prison you're getting information through such a grapevine, and he wasn't present for everything that happened to Andy, and so often he'd heard something from someone else who maybe heard it from something else or saw something and made their own assumptions. And so we're definitely exposed to the idea of the grapevine, and it's one which really sort of causes you to stop and question what it is that you're reading and just assess how accurate or believable what is going on is. And you really want to believe it because Red, especially when you're hearing his voice as Morgan Freeman, just seems like such an authoritative character that you want to believe, but you're also very much aware that you're getting this information through so many filters that it's definitely not a reliable narrative. But it was really, really interesting story. I'm glad that I finally read it, and I'm definitely, like I said, going to read the other books in this short story, but for now, that was a great start. So there we have it, 6.5 books in June, and I think it's clear that I loved all of them. I ended up with 1.5 4-star reads and then 5 5-star reads, which I'm fairly confident is the most 5-star reads I've ever given out, but I just couldn't help it because it was just such a great reading month and there were so many good books in there. I'd clearly recommend all of these books because they were all so good, so definitely let me know if you've read any of them, if you had similar thoughts to me, or if not, definitely try and pick them up and let me know what you think. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.